Training zones are some of the most debated and arguably pointlessly debated things in the endurance industry. So in this video, we're going to talk about, does it actually matter what you use? Some people like to use 3, 5, 7, 9, 12 zone systems, but does any of that actually matter if you don't understand what the basic principles backing those systems are? In this video, we're going to talk about the 3 key things you need to know before you make your decision, regardless of which way you go, on what system of training zones you want to use. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Nick here, making sports science simple. And in this video, we're talking all about training zones, regardless of the system you use, because I know there's a lot of debate around what might be better. Some people like 5 zones. Some people use the Garmin ones. Some people like use Training Peaks, 3 zone systems, 9, 7, based on different percentages of maximum heart rate, FTP, VO2 max, whatever it might be. There's a lot of different ideas and theories around how you should monitor or track your training through zones, or how you can distribute your training to make sure that you are getting a bit of the right adaptations out of your physiology when you are out there in a session. So we're going to break down the couple of key things you need to understand. The first one being is fundamentally training zones are built on the same key parts of our physiology. That being the top end of your, base aerobic training, which is fundamentally your VT1, your ventilatory threshold 1, or your lactate threshold 1. That basically happens at the same point. And what these points are is a slight change from the body working quite comfortably and easily to now we're starting to increase, and there's a little bit of a change in things like ventilation, hence why we have what's called a VT1, ventilatory threshold 1, increase our air intake. Why? Because it's a response to an increase in lactate production. We might see a change from say 2 millimole in the lab to 3, all right? There's a little bit of an increase. It's not dramatic, and it's something that you lift the intensity past that point, and it's not gonna feel like you blow up very, very quick. But it's a difference between being comfortable and comfortably hard, which for most people is the difference between their base aerobic, long, slow, maybe a zone 2 if you want to call it that. That's what I tend to call it. This endurance type aerobic capacity zone, we feel like you can go at it all day, versus the beginnings of a tempo type intensity. So that is the first part of it. There's always going to be something there. There's always another point that's very similar to that, but it's a little bit more pronounced. And this is where we see some bigger changes in things like ventilation and blood lactate for the same reasons. Body's starting to work a little bit harder, the intensity's up, we need to produce a bit of energy quicker, and we're going to have a little bit more anaerobic contribution. And that's what we call our VT2 or our LT2, ventilatory threshold 2, LT2 being lactate threshold 2. What is this point? Well, we know this from all of the training and stuff that you might have read is lactate threshold or functional threshold, anaerobic threshold. This is the point we're now talking about, that theoretical 45 to an hour intensity that most people will be working some part of their training off or in and around. It's a critical part. This point in our physiology is the part that makes up what percentage of the engine can we hold. How high of an intensity it is also one of the key indicators for sports performance. If you have a much faster pace at lactate threshold than the person standing next to you at the start line, well, you're probably going to come out with a much faster race result, everything else being equal. So lactate threshold is VT2, LT2, whatever you want to call it, is a really critical part. The other final critical part is VO2 max, because this dictates the size of the overall engine. And we've mentioned this on the channel time and time again. It's the maximum amount of oxygen we can take in, transport, and utilize. So really it is the upper limit of what can our aerobic system do. Everything below that, VT1, VT2, all these points I've just identified, everything is below VO2 max. So the size of your overall engine will dictate, well, what percentage can I hold and what intensity is that? You have a bigger engine, you can run faster at the top end. Well, ultimately the bottom end comes up with that and works the opposite way as well. Smaller engine, you're not going to be able to do as much with. It's also a key indicator to go, all right, where and what intensity, what heart rate, what pace, whatever it might be, is my maximal oxygen consumption occurring? Because that's going to tell me how much can my aerobic system do. Pretty much majority of the work in terms of energy production. Beyond this VO2 max point, it's not a flick the switch, I now become anaerobic. I'm significantly having to increase my anaerobic contributions beyond this point because I'm not getting any more from the aerobic system. I've hit my maximum, my max aerobic output, if you like, in terms of energy production. There's no more. So any further increase in the intensity is going to be coming more and more from the anaerobic systems. The higher and higher you go, eventually at some point it does become more so anaerobic energy production than aerobic. Not straight away. It's a gradual progression. But that's where it gives us a bit of an indicator that, like, I can't use any more oxygen, so I can't be any more aerobic than I am right now. That's why those 3 points are really, really key, because they're the fundamental changes in our physiology that are going to dictate different parts and different adaptations based on where we sit in relation to those points. Second thing we really need to understand is how do these 3 parts link in? And as I said before, it doesn't really matter what zone system we use. It's understanding these 3 parts and where do they feature. Our VT1, in my circumstance, I use a 5-zone system. That sits at the top of my zone 2. So I know zone 2 is that space to do that long, slow, continuous type training, build the aerobic capacity, work on really highly aerobic adaptations. I know that the top end of my zone 4 though is my VO2 max. So if I'm working just below the top end of that zone 4, between my threshold, which is the top end of my zone 3, and there, I'm going to be getting some really good aerobic adaptation in terms of building the size of the engine. If I'm working in more zone 3, I'm getting more adaptation in terms of the percentage of the engine I can hold. You might use a 3-zone system, you might use a 7-zone system. Again, these parts will feature prominently across those, so it's really important you understand that any zone system is going to feature the same things. Our physiology isn't different because you use a 7-zone or a 5-zone or a 3-zone. It's just understanding where do these key parts occur, because those key parts are the things that are driving the stimulus and driving the adaptation in the sessions that we're looking at doing. The third thing we need to consider is then choose a system that makes sense for you. No point jumping into your training and going, I'm going to use a 7 or a 9-zone system because that's what sounds the fanciest or looks the most complicated, or that's what this elite athlete or particular sports scientist or professional is using. If you look at the zones, you don't actually know what each of those mean and the purpose of each of those zones are. You may not actually use all of those zones. The classic example is, I know a lot of cyclists like to use maybe 7 or 9-zone systems where it's quite refined. There's small little blocks of 10, 15 watts that might be defined in things like sweet spot and sub-threshold and super threshold and all of these fancy terms. You might have zone 5A, zone 5B, etc. That's okay because they fully understand what is happening in each of those, and they can distinguish and define those different sessions and the point or the purpose of having those zones. For people who can't, maybe it's a simpler case of like what I use, a 5-zone system where we have 1 zone for active recovery, 1 zone for our long, slow, continuous aerobic endurance, 1 for our tempo and threshold, 1 for our VO2 max, and then 1 for more anaerobic well above VO2 max. That's a nice simple way to look at it. Going even simpler again, if you're a team sport athlete out there, maybe you just want to look at it as easy, medium, hard. And for the most part, you're not going to really do much medium intensity. You're probably going to do a lot of aerobic capacity, maybe in the off season, early pre-season, and then largely it's going to be repeat effort, high intensity in that sort of zone 3, that upper end near VO2 max. But ultimately, those points I mentioned before, VT1, VT2, and VO2 max fundamentally are going to feature in each of those zones, regardless of which one you use. So it then becomes about understanding and knowing what you're using them for, so that you go into a session and you know you're going for the adaptations you're wanting to. Nothing worse than I talk to athletes or coaches of athletes who work with a particular zone system. They're talking about all this great training and all these things they want to do, and then wondering why they're not getting the adaptation when fundamentally they've just misinterpreted what the zones mean. They jump into a session, they're working 1 zone above where they need to, which ultimately is going to maybe overcook the athlete or provide too much of a stimulus. Particularly that's the case when we're looking for a zone 2 or base case type stimulus and people end up running in tempo, or vice versa, it's trying to go for a VO2 stimulus and they're not working hard enough. They're the classic ones. Easy sessions aren't easy enough and the hard sessions aren't hard enough, that we fall into some gray zone type areas and we just miss the boat. And ultimately, if you're not targeting really specifically the right areas of physiology to get those adaptations just through misinterpretation of zones, that's going to throw out a lot of your training. So hopefully that clears up a little bit of the behind the scenes aspect, or what actually makes up training zones, and the key points you need to focus on. At the end of the day, I'm not here to preach a particular system. I know I've mentioned I use a 5-zone, but if you want to use a 7 or a 9 or a 3, it doesn't really matter. That's probably the big takeaway from this video, is it doesn't matter which zone system you use, as long as you understand what are the components of physiology that do matter and make a big difference, as I mentioned before, and how do those align with the zone system that makes the most sense to me. That combination there, really powerful, bringing together of knowledge, is going to allow you to maximize your training sessions regardless of which way you go about it. So always happy to hear what you guys use and your guys' thoughts on this comment. So please leave them down below. Let me know what zone system you use. Do you use 3, 5, 7, 9, alternative versions to that? Do you not use zones at all? Let me know down below. Maybe leave some notes as well on what are the key zones out of that you use, some little definitions of how you interpret those zones, so we can get a bit of an idea. Has any of the stuff I've mentioned sort of made you think a bit differently about those zones? always leave your thoughts down in the comments. Happy to have a look at those and respond and get involved with the people in the community who are watching and looking at these videos. I'm going to leave it there for today. Hopefully you got a little bit out of this little chat about training zones, and we'll see you in the next one.